my name is Gabby. I've been doing climate activism for 3 years. I only found out that there was a problem with the climate emergency about 3 years ago. So that tells you a lot about the problem that people just don't know. So I've done a lot of actions and frontline climate activism for a few years, and it's been the most rewarding and life-fulfilling experience, that when you take action, you suddenly feel a lot better about the horrific situation that we're in. So that's me. So first we're going to speak to David Pratt, who's joining us from Australia. I think it's 7 a.m. in Melbourne at the minute. So thank you so much, David, for getting up that early. So like I said, David is a research director for Breakthrough National Centre for Climate Restoration. They've got an amazing website that's got loads of resources on in a way that's really easy for people to understand. So I recommend that people go and check that out. Breakthrough National Centre for Climate Restoration. There's loads of resources on there in a way that's really accessible. He's also the co-author of the book Climate Code Red, The Case for Emergency Action. That was written in 2008. When I saw that, I was just like, oh my goodness, you've been doing this for so long. Like, yeah, I'm so sorry that you've been doing this for so long and people are still, that this is still an issue. David's going to talk about the reticence of scientists and why for 30 years they failed to communicate in plain language what it means for climate to break down. So yeah, it's quite heavy, and thank you so much for joining us, David. I'm going to pass straight over to you.
Thanks very much, Gabby, and good evening. I think good evening to most of you, though it's good morning at 7:10 in the morning on a summer's morning on the coast outside Melbourne on the southern part of Australia. So hello to everybody. The breakthrough site that Gabby just mentioned is breakthroughonline.org.au, breakthroughonline.org.au. And as Gabby said, I was involved in writing a book called Climate Code Red, The Case for Emergency Action, which was published 40 years ago. And everybody said those ideas were really crazy. Well, 14 years later, that language doesn't seem quite so crazy. It seems to become mainstream, which is at least a step forward. When I started to write about this 17 years ago, almost all the talk in the media and in policymaking circles was about 2 degrees being an acceptable limit for global warming. And in fact, back in 2006, Sir Nicholas Stern did a report for the UK government, which amazingly now said he looked at 2 degrees or 3 degrees of warming as a goal for the government and said, look, 2 degrees would be too economically disruptive. So let's go for 3 degrees of warming, which seems incredible in retrospect. So that's where Stern started. So that was one thing I came across. Then I came across the work of James Hansen, who was then director of climate science at NASA, often known as the grandfather of climate science. And he was saying that 2 degrees was what he called a recipe for disaster. And he pointed to the planet's climate history, which showed that if you wanted to maintain the coastlines and the society we've got now, you would actually have to keep warming under 1 degree or under 350 parts per million. We're now at 420. He also pointed out that in the longer run, every 1 degree of warming increases sea levels by 10 to 20 meters. And he said the world, and this was in 2007, was, quote, on the edge of a precipice beyond which there was no redemption. So here were these two worlds, politicians and people like Stern talking about 2 to 3 degrees and Hansen talking about under 1. So how do you reconcile these two really parallel universes? And what I really discovered was in one world you had politicians and the process of politics trying to negotiate with the laws of physics and chemistry, which is a really silly thing to do. And seemingly there were too many scientists who lived in a world where they relied too much on climate models. And the problem was, and I'm sure Jason will talk about this as he has recently, the models were not and are still not up to scratch in dealing with all of the Earth's climate systems. Many climate processes are non-linear and they're difficult to predict. This is particularly true of ice sheets, Jason's specialty. where it's the models are still not to scratch to work out what's going on with ice sheets and be able to predict what will happen, and therefore they can't predict sea level rises either. So in 2007, there was a really big melt of sea ice in the Arctic, and Richard Alley, a glaciologist, said it's melting 100 years ahead of schedule, literally, quote, 100 years ahead of schedule. What he was actually saying was that the scientific knowledge was 100 years behind schedule. In 2014, Eric Rigneau showed that some West Antarctic glaciers were past their tipping points, and scientists everywhere said, a lot of scientists said they were shocked by this, which they shouldn't have. And now, as Jason will talk about, Greenland is also past its tipping point. So what we're finding is that climate change in these aspects is happening faster than forecast. Now, models don't represent the whole of the climate system well, and they get some of these basics wrong. So what we need, and this is what Jim Hansen has always done, we need a balanced approach to understanding the science, which is more based on observations, on what's called paleoclimatology, or learning from climate history, and expert elicitations, expert opinions, and not so much a one-sided reliance on models, which is what we tend to get in the work of the International Panel on Climate Change. Even now in my own country, recently, 3 professors from the University of New South Wales put out a paper on tipping points, and they said, at the current temperatures, we will get 5 to 10 meters of sea level rise based on what happened 120,000 years ago. And for the current level of carbon dioxide, which will produce more warming, it would be 10 to 25 meters of sea level rise based on some history 3 million years ago. Now, that sort of statement should be shouted from the rooftops. The current temperature will produce 5 to 10 meters, but I don't think what they said was reported in the media, not once. So this is the first problem, it's an over-reliance on models. The second problem is the way that risk is managed. So you'll hear all the time in the reports of the IPCC on carbon budgets and, you know, how much the temperature will rise. I talk about a 50 or 66% chance of keeping under the target, for example, 2 degrees. The problem with that is that there's therefore a 33 to 50% chance of failure of exceeding the target. Now, the problem, I think there is a moral one, is that scientists and policymakers are taking risks with the planet that they wouldn't take with their own children. If you said to somebody, will you let your kids jump into the surf or into the swimming pool if there's a 1 in 3 chance of them drowning? And they'd say, no, of course not. But they keep on putting out papers saying, here's the carbon budget, there's a 1/3 chance that we'll fail. This is just not acceptable. The risks are now existential. That is a threat to human civilization as we know it. And when risks are existential, unlike other experiments, you can't repeat the experiment, because if you've blown up civilization, you can't learn from your mistake and do it again. And therefore, with existential risks, you have to take a different approach, which is to ask the question, what's the worst thing that can happen and how do we avoid it? And that question is not being asked by the IPCC. That is, you look at the worst possibilities and work out how you would respond, not the middle of the road outcomes. So we put out a report 3 or 4 years ago called What Lies Beneath, which is on the website, with a foreword by John Schellenhuber, who was then director of the Potsdam Institute and an advisor to Angela Merkel, to the EU, and to Pope Francis. So a very eminent scientist. And he wrote in that foreword, and I'll quote, "When the issue is the survival of civilization, conventional means of scientific analysis may become useless," unquote. And he was there talking about the IPCC. So that's the problem, bad risk management. The next question, of course, is politics. So IPCC reports, and I have to say, I mean, there are many great scientists in the world. I'm not lumping all scientists together, but there's a process of groupthink that goes on. IPCC reports are at the intersection of science and politics, because the reports are used to inform the policy-making processes at the COPs. And the lead authors of IPCC reports are actually appointed by diplomats. And so these reports too often tend to reflect the policy-making paradigm. Let me give you some examples of the problems that you get with this process. First of all, the scientific method itself has a very high bar for evidence. Unless you can absolutely prove your case, you can't publish. So it's not, this is likely to be true. You've got to prove your case, which is reasonable in one sense. The reports are often overcautious, and I think some scientists and scientists in Australia have said this to me, that they're overcautious because they have been under pressure from denialists and denialist politicians. In the IPCC reports, there's an overemphasis on models. There's a downplaying of the evidence from climate history, and there's a downplaying of the role of expert opinion. And there's also a sort of a groupthink. And I'll give you one really clear example. The IPCC reports really focused on 2 degrees and 3 degrees and 4 degrees. And the IPCC reports didn't really look at 1.5 degrees until after 2015, when the politicians in Paris asked them to look at it. So this was a really clear example of the IPCC only picking up 1.5 degrees when the politicians asked them to. So this was science following politics. Models, particularly the climate economy models, tend to reflect the social views of the modelers. Then, of course, there's the question of where the research funding is allocated. As I said, a poor approach to risk. And finally, a process of the IPCC, which is consensus-based. That is, 195 countries have to sign off on every sentence in the summaries for policymakers, which makes it a very slow-moving, lowest common denominator outcome. So there's some of the sorts of reasons why the scientific story we get, and the IPCC too much dominates that in the international media, is often reticent, out of date, and things are moving faster than forecast. So what to do? I know quite a few scientists who actually think the IPCC should be scrapped because it's no longer got a positive role to play. I think it's up to us to listen to and amplify the voices of all the great non-reticent scientists, and there are many. Jim Hansen, Kevin Anderson in your country, and Sir David King, the work of the Climate Crisis Action Group out of Cambridge, people like John Schellenhuber, Jason, who you hear from next, Stefan Ramsdorf, Catherine Ho, and so on. So there are many great scientists whose voices need to be amplified. The evidence is that tipping points are already in play at 1.2 degrees, including in Greenland, West Antarctica, the Amazon, and for coral reefs. 1.5 is 10 years away, no matter what we do. And we may then start to see a cascade of these tipping points, accelerating warming and driving faster heating as the system moves into more difficult circumstances, what some climate scientists have called the hothouse Earth scenario. So we as activists really need to understand the science and the risks to amplify the story and tell it in an accessible, evidence-based and heartfelt manner, and then provide the agency, the courage to elaborate on the actions, that is mitigation, reduction to zero fast, drawing down carbon to reduce the amount of CO2 in the atmosphere, and cooling, which Sir David King has talked about, particularly in relation to the Arctic, to return the climate to safer conditions. We now face incredible risks to human civilization. John Schellenhuber, who I mentioned before, in that same report he did for us, said, and I quote, "If we continue down the present path, there is a very big risk that we will just end our civilization. The human species will survive somehow, but we will destroy almost everything we have built up over the last 2,000 years." That is the understanding of scientists who are really onto it. And it's on that basis that we have to ask the questions, what do we need to do to stop that happening, and with all the heartfelt courage that we can muster, persuade the rest of society that that's the path to go down. This is the story we need to tell every day. So thanks very much, Gabby. I think that's a couple of minutes under 20 minutes.
Thank you so much. I'm re-traumatized all over again, and I think it's really important. Thank you. And apologies, David, for saying your last name wrong as well. I think, you know, a bit nervous as a climate activist being in the room with like actual climate scientists. It's a bit like, oh. Yeah, thank you. I think it's really important to hear that as many times as we dare to, because although it's really difficult, it's also really motivating. So thank you. Let's go to Jason. Jason is a professor of glaciology, an ice climatologist at the Geological Survey of Denmark and Greenland, and he's joining us today from Copenhagen. Jason's well known for the Dark Snow project in 2014 that measured the impact of changing wildfire and industrial soot and snow microbes on snow and ice reflectivity. He's one of the most outspoken scientists in the world today. He's quite active on Twitter, so if you're on Twitter, do follow him. It's @climate_ice. I'll pop that in the chat in a moment. He'll speak about his specialism, which is the melting of the ice in Greenland, and he'll explain what it is, along with the melting of the ice in the Arctic, and what that means for our lives over the coming decades. Thank you so much for joining us, Jason. I'll pass straight over to you.
Thanks. It's good to be here. Hey, excellent summary by David on the reticence topic. I fully agree with all what he said. Again, excellent summary. I'm going to share some slides. I hope that's not too stiff. I'm going to take you through a brief slice through my science career, and I hope that that is helpful. I'm going to share my screen. Here we go. So I entitled this, one moment, please, just. Okay, so I've done a lot of work looking at observations. What are the measurements? And it's like nature is revealing what's going on. We just have to listen. So this is the story that the Arctic climate is telling us if we're listening. So I've been a contributing author on the last 3 IPCC reports, and I would say that the science there is quite strong. David's point that there's an over-reliance on modeling, it's a good point. There's also a lot of physical science in there. On reticence, I want to say that, as David mentioned, you need unanimous signatories from all of these nations, including Saudi Arabia, Brazil, Russia, these petrostates. And that's one reason when the highest level reports, not the technical science reports that I just showed, but the summary for policymakers, the highest level, those get muted or blunted because you have to satisfy these petrostates. But I'll talk about Arctic climate. I'm part of the climate expert group for an Arctic Council activity called AMAP, Arctic Monitoring and Assessment Program. We are publishing IPCC-like reports, thick, well-illustrated, externally reviewed compilations of the latest science. We've got a new one coming out soon. And that process gave me a high-level view of the full Arctic. So I will talk about Greenland, but I'll also zoom out to the Arctic and then connect the Arctic with the rest of the world. A bit about me: born at 326 parts per million CO2. In college, I was getting into astronomy and computer science when I took a course and realized that we were up 30% CO2. And it was, in fact, these Keeling curves showing atmospheric pollutants on these exponential rises that inspired me to step away from astronomy and try to focus on dealing with problems on planet Earth. I was fortunate to get connected to a research program in Greenland. And for 11 years of starting in my 20s, I was installing and maintaining a network of automatic weather stations on the inland ice. So we had 20 of these kind of stations. I spent more than a year camping on Greenland, and this turned into a fantastic career. After the University of Colorado, I went to Ohio State, and in addition to meteorology coursework, for 9 years, I was teaching intro to environmental issues and like world geography. And that gave me a really broad perspective on the global long, dirty laundry list of environmental issues. Along the way, I continued working on Greenland, doing a lot of kind of climatology at the intersection of glaciology. And the types of learning, it became abundantly clear that, you know, the models can never really reach this level of detail that we have in nature. Racked up a lot of publications. This is what people do in academic careers. They publish technical articles. It's really tedious to write these things, and they compose a body of work that you know, allows me to talk about this stuff. Basically burned out and took a job in Denmark, reboot on my life, got out of the academic thing because it's quite a tough treadmill, and but continued to do this climate recording work. The red circles are the Danish network, and we're actually now running both networks. So we're responsible for 40 of these stations. This ends up spending a lot of time on the ice, and what you see there is, you're like, yeah, this is not in the models. And I want to talk about that. Yeah. So I think a useful narrative is to follow the water. It's like, if you want to understand politics in DC, Washington, DC, you follow the money. Well, if you want to understand the ice, it's useful to follow the water. And let me take you to West Greenland. There's a dark band that's low on the ice sheet. It is where you get a lot of lakes forming. The lakes, like this one, it's 30 million cubic meters. They actually drain rapidly. They are forming higher in elevation. They are draining more rapidly. And this is one example of factors that are not yet in the models. Yet these pools of water absorb more sunlight. When they drain, they lead to a tectonic upheaval that kind of rips up the ice, and the water flowing at the bed accelerates 3x. None of this is in the models. This is just one factor. The water drains in. It's several degrees warmer than the ice internally. And so the doubling of meltwater that's happened in the last 50 years, it's heating the ice internally. This thermal collapse is not in the models used to predict future sea level rise. The water then reaches the bed and it lubricates flow. This effect is not in the climate models. The water rushes out the front in places where the water terminates in the sea. It entrains mud from the bottom of the ice that you can see in this photo. The ice, the water is turbulent. It forces a turbulent heat exchange that you can see here. This is a convective heat transfer, much more efficient than just thermal diffusion. This cartoon illustrates how it's typical for there to be a warm layer below 300 meters. Those red arrows illustrate this warm Atlantic layer. The fresh water rushing up the front of the ice, it entrains this warm water and forces forced convection melting right at the grounding line. That's where the ice loses contact with the ground, and erosion of ice right there is the best way to get that ice to accelerate, and that is increasing with both ocean warming and increasing forced convection. Neither of those processes are in the models used to project sea rise in the future. Hydrofracture. We see really big ice shelf disintegration during record warm summers. The rifts are being flooded with water. This hydrofracture effect is not in the models. The algal blooms under prolonged sunshine darken the surface, absorbs more sunlight. It's another amplifying effect not in the models. So you can see that when you stack up all of these actual processes, you get a response from the ice which is much faster than it can be encoded in models. As David said, we simply cannot rely on models for a lot of things at the level of fidelity that we're talking in nature. It's infinite, and we're using like a fax machine to try to represent the process. It's not useful. All right, I want to zoom out now as I race through this material to talk about the Arctic at large. What you have on the horizontal axis is time from 1880 to present. On the vertical axis, you've got latitude. At the top, it's the North Pole. And the red colors you see on the right, that is the Arctic warming much faster than the rest of the world. I think that's the main significance of the Arctic. Its connection with the rest of the world is through Arctic amplified warming. And this is a reconstruction from lakes and driftwood showing a summer cooling in the Arctic the last 2,000 years. That was an orbitally induced cooling. Then there's an abrupt warming. This has this hockey stick shape that the abrupt warming is from industrialization, the addition of carbon pollution to the atmosphere. And that takes us up to the present. The instrumental record is this red curve. Now, what I'm going to show you next is I've pasted on, I had to do this. I pasted on the projections of Arctic summer temperatures into the future. And this is what we have heading. This is where we're heading. Same curve. I had to put on the axis. This should be, maybe front cover of the IPCC report, how even in an optimistic scenario, there are two curves going off to the right. The Paris scenario, we're still looking at a huge warming in the Arctic. The business as usual is the 6 degrees of Arctic summer warming. There is a difference between those two. Basically, by limiting carbon emissions and getting into carbon drawdown, we can put on the brakes and we can slow down this disaster. But I'm sorry, we're not avoiding this. It is for sure coming for the foreseeable future. We would have to have an external influence like a comet. That was the only thing that's in the cards, as unlikely as it is, to alter this warming trajectory. For AMAP, I made this plot about sea level contributions from Arctic and Greenland. Okay, Greenland is the largest single contributor to sea rise in the world. You add on Alaska, Arctic Canada, etc., you get these kinds of curves. The land ice, the glaciers, they are having a really delayed response to Arctic warming. And I do not consider them the primary concern. Nevertheless, the gray lines illustrate how in every successive decade, the rate of sea rise is increasing. In other words, it's accelerating. That much we know. We really can't predict this other than using paleo data, like David was saying. It is fair to conclude that at current CO2, we've baked in 15 meters of sea level rise. That is the committed sea rise. Over the timescale, we don't really know. And it's so difficult to predict when you're working with nonlinear curves. Tiny changes in the initial conditions greatly affect the outcome, and we lack the models to project this into the future. We do have paleo data, and those do show we have had dramatic sea rise in the past. Civilization has developed under extremely stable climate that's been called the Holocene. That was preceded by the Pleistocene Ice Age. You can see the sea rise, 120 meters of sea rise after the disintegration of the Laurentide ice sheet and the Fennoscandian ice sheet. They're gone. Now we have a relic of ice sheet on Greenland and the polar ice sheet in the south. Anyway, the Holocene climate, very steady, sea level very steady. This when the position of the coastline is predictable, then you can build coastal infrastructure, because you can build that port city because the sea isn't changing rapidly. That's one of the factors that allowed civilization to develop, like predictable rainfall patterns. The farmers could say, yeah, well, this is the rainy season and it's like that more or less every year. That was the Holocene. In terms of sea rise, the Big Bend there for scale, this is what we are faced with for the future. The time scale, it's hard to establish. Anyway, as you can see, there is a difference. If we could lock in constant 1990 emissions, which would be a pretty big achievement, we're still looking at tens of meters of sea rise committed. Business as usual, 50 meters. I mean, imagine the impact on hundreds of coastal cities. It's a preposterous concept. My final point, it's about how Arctic warming leads to persistent weather extremes. In other words, droughts or flooding conditions. When the weather gets stuck in one pattern, like it's raining, a little bit of rain's great, but if too much of a good thing, you get flooding. That's what this is about. And Arctic warming is central to this issue. The jet stream, the river of air that separates the cold air in the Arctic to the north and the warm air to the south, this depends on the Arctic being cold, but Arctic is warming 3x the rate of the world. What that is doing is slowing down the jet stream, making it wave more and leading to more persistent weather extremes. That's what this illustrates. It's a more north-south wave pattern, and it's moving more slowly toward the east. That is the emerging picture. That's what's threatening food security. There's lots of headlines like this, 2015, 2018, European heat wave, this the northwestern U.S. Pacific Northwest, it was the same thing, this omega pattern. On the right, there's, if you can see the little omega symbol, it's because of the shape of this wave. A persistent high pressure over Europe there means lots of sunshine. And if that keeps up, the crops start to fail. You lose water security. This pattern is how we're starting to get 40 degrees temperatures on continental Europe. Think back to the Russian heat wave of 2010. That was one of these events. Russia halted grain exports. It sent global food price commodity spiking. It led to food riots. This is what to expect because of this wavy problem with the jet stream, and it's been very clearly documented in this and other articles where these are the wave numbers, and this table has like the August 2003 heat wave in Europe. More than 40,000 people died because they were unprepared for the persistent heat. Actually, 75,000 died that heat wave summer. There are other, the Pakistani heat floods 2010, practically every year now has these types of extremes. This study, I think, really does well. And John Schellenbuehler that David mentioned, you can see him on the authorship of this article. This is really hard science. Basically, the same authors later published an alarm bell about breadbasket failure because of this same wave pattern thing, pointing out that the grain that's grown in Russia, Europe, North America is strongly threatened by Arctic climate heating. That is what is the beginning of this story of this wave disruption of our weather patterns. This points to the concentration of population in the tropics. We're very fortunate up north, really. We will escape a lot of this unrest, at least directly. This is really a problem of or a bigger problem for the global south. This horrible issue of migration will continue to intensify because the tropics are becoming uninhabitable, and also, as you know, politically unstable. It was a shitty political situation to begin with, and if you pile on top of that loss of food and water security, that is a very ungovernable situation. Yeah, that was my final slide. Sorry for having to race through all of that material, but and sorry to ruin your Saturday evening, but hopefully this will give us some energy to get out there and make the world a better place.
Thank you so much, Jason. I've had a very emotional reaction to all of that. I apologize. Sorry.
Yeah, it sucks. The economic externalities, like that's what deregulated economics has delivered us. It's the price that we're paying because the party's over.
Thank you for explaining it in a way that I can understand. I think I sort of knew a lot of stuff, but didn't really understand how or why. Thank you. I'm just going to pass over because for obvious reasons. We're going to hear next from Roger, who's going to talk about what we can do about this. Roger co-founded Extinction Rebellion, Insulate Britain, and Just Stop Oil, which is the newest campaign.
Yeah, thank you very much, Gabby. And thank you very much, everyone, for coming on the call. And I'd really like to thank David and Jason for doing such amazing work, you know, over years and years. And I count, what I want to say is these people have been telling us this information for a long time. And there's a specific reason why the first political and social event of the new year is about the intrinsic conservatism of the science and the scientific establishment. I know there's many people on this call, including myself, who've been pulling our hair out for a good few years now of saying it's so much worse than we're being told. And this is like it's a critical understanding that we have to engage with. Absolutely critical in 2021. It is so much worse, as Jason and David have explained. And this conservatism has been going on for decades, as we're aware. And in 2022, we're here post COP26. And we all know that COP26 was the final exposure of this gross underestimation, this obscene underestimation of the risks and the suffering that we're imposing upon literally billions of people. And the key question of this session tonight is not, oh, isn't it terrible? Those days have gone. The days when we come onto a video and find out how terrible it is and go off the video and go, wasn't that terrible? Those days have gone. The days we're entering into in 2022, the key question is, what are our responsibilities at this time? These two guys have spent decades telling us what's going on. The key question now is, what are our responsibilities in response to what Jason and David and hundreds of scientists have been telling us? It's our job now. They've done their job. We all know that, right? They've done their job. What's our job? Our job is to take responsibility as parents, as citizens, as human beings. What does this actually mean? I mean, you're probably aware that myself and several other people have been seeing talks 5 or 6 times a week, you know, and the first thing we talk about is the social conservatism of the science. As many of you know, we start with that article in The Conversation with 3 of the world's leading scientists saying, at the Paris conference of 2015, we did not know of a single scientist who thought we were going to stay under 1.5. That's an absolute scandal, is it not? It's an absolute scandal. We know from Chatham House, it's done. 1.5 is done. There's a 1% chance of staying under 1.5, according to one of the most conservative think tanks in this country. So why are we still talking about it? Why are we still putting up with the government and the establishment still telling us about 1.5? As many of you know, like I'm a sociologist, I studied at King's College. How do you find out the social truth? You ask people for their private opinions so that they can be honest. There was a survey of IPC scientists, only 4% privately thought we can stay under 1.5. Only 4%, 96% think it's done. You've heard this from Jason tonight, you've heard it from David. We know because the scientists have told us we're heading to 2 degrees. We know when we get to 2 degrees, we're heading for 3 degrees. We know when we're at 3 degrees, we're heading for 4 degrees. It's a domino effect, as Jason has shown. 100 million people will be on the move at 2 degrees, according to the future of the human niche. All the major cities in the world will be underwater. It's locked in, as Jason has said. 5, 10, 50 meters, it doesn't matter, it's done. Who's in denial about this? We're not in denial about it anymore. We know from Sir David King, we have 3 to 4 years left. Britain's top scientists saying 3 to 4 years left. We've been saying this, haven't we? In Insulate Britain, we've been saying it around the world. This is the new mantra, which is forcing thousands of people to look in the mirror and go, what is the responsibilities at this time for me, knowing we have 3 to 4 years left to prevent an absolute obscene catastrophe imposed on billions of people that are entirely innocent of what's been going on. What's our responsibilities? The key question tonight on this call is not how bad it is. The key question is, what is our response? What is actually going on here morally and politically? And I put it to you all that COP26 was an act of war. It's an act of murder. It's a conscious decision by the world's elites to not act, and in not acting, subject billions of people to indescribable suffering. We know sea level rise will subject sovereign states to annihilation. At COP26, as some of you know, there was a minister from one of the small island states, and he said, you might as well come over and bomb us. That's the betrayal over the last decade of locking in 1.5 degrees, which is the destruction of people, the destruction of countries. Can you imagine if someone came to Britain and said, we are going to destroy your country and we're very upset about that, but so be it. No, no, no. What would we be saying? Oh, that's a little bit unfortunate. That shows a little bit of lack of ambition. No, we wouldn't, would we? We'd be saying that's an absolute outrage. We know what we would be doing. That's what we're imposing on the small island states. That's what we're imposing on billions of the poorest people in Africa, in Central America, in India, in the Middle East. And most especially, that's what we're imposing on the younger generation. That's what we're imposing on people on this call who are in their 20s and in their teens. Jason says, it sucks, right? It sucks. Everyone knows it sucks. The key question is, what the fuck are we going to do? And this is the key denial. I put it to everyone on this call, all 230 of you. You know precisely what needs to happen. This is the real denial. The real denial is not about the science. The real denial is not about our moral responsibility. The real denial is the pretense that we do not know what to do. We absolutely do want to know what to do. If the dead bodies were in the home counties instead of Malawi and Madagascar, of course we know what we do. We go on the streets. Everyone knows what to do. So that's what we need to do. We know what to do because we've already done it, haven't we? You know, in April 2019, 10,000 people went on the streets of London and they changed the conversation. You know, last year, Insulate Britain with 100 people dominated the headlines with 100 people going on the road. 270 national articles. That's 100 people. We know the social science, so let's not be in denial about it. The social sciences, if thousands of people go on the streets and they stay on the streets, we will get legislative change. Thousands of people went onto the motorways in Serbia 4 or 5 weeks ago, and they turned around government policy in 2 weeks. The Serbian government was going to sell mining rights to Rio Tinto Zinc and Chinese companies, and Serbian people 10, 20,000 people went on the motorways and they said no, and they won. This has been done 100 times. We know what to do. The campaign of Just Stop Oil is the campaign in 2022 which has to win. I'm not on this call to say this is just another campaign. We're not in a position to be saying, hey, we're going to do a new campaign. No, it's not a campaign. It's a mad dash to prevent the inexpressible suffering and injustice to young people, to the poorest people on the planet. That's what it is. We've got 3 to 4 years. We can't afford to lose, can we? We can't afford to do whatever is non-violently necessary. That's our responsibility. It's the responsibility of Jason and David to give us this information. It's our responsibility to act. What Just Stop Oil is doing is making that precise line in the sand, which says, you will not, as the UK government, dig up, explore and drill for new oil. There's a specific campaign. There's a line in the sand. You will not go over that line. The International Energy Authority has said, if governments allow companies to dig up more oil, 2 degrees is absolutely locked in. 2 degrees is 1,000 million people on the road, leaving where they've had to live for 1,000 years. It's the ultimate act of injustice, is it not? So this is what these calls are about. These calls are not about it sucks. These calls are about it sucks and what do we need to do? What we need to do is a precise thing, which is sign up tonight to engage in civil disobedience. It's at the end of March and there's a specific concrete ask to engage in collective action to force the UK government for the first time to actually enact legislation which is going to literally save the human race. And yes, this is being done in many other Western democracies at the same time, as people on this call are aware. In Australia, the US, in Canada, in Germany, in Italy, hundreds and thousands of people will be going onto the road. And they'll be staying there because we can't afford to lose. So the precise ask is this, right? Is to commit in the breakout groups to go onto the road at least once and risk arrest. You may not be arrested. If you are arrested, many of you know, you get taken to a police station, you go in a police cell, you're let out early in the morning. That's it. It's absolutely essential. And there's been a big change, right? This is 2022. We're now on the go. We're now on the go. We're not in the middle of COVID and lockdowns. We are now back on the go. This is like April 2019. You know, it took 6 months to find 120 people to go on the road with Insulate Britain. Our action form has been up for 10 days. We're already approaching 150 signups. We're going to get thousands of signups. That's the plan. This is it, right? Yeah, I'm Roger Hallam. I'm telling you, this is it, right? You know, I did the design for 2019. You know that, right? I did the design for Insulate Britain. This is it. I'm putting myself on the line to you. It is it. You know, like before Insulate Britain, we had 10 people doing mobilization. Now we've got 60 people. Before Insulate Britain, there was hardly any people working full-time on mobilization. We now have 20 young people working part-time and full-time on mobilization. This is happening in lots of different countries. It's going up exponentially. I have business people talking to me, offering millions of pounds because they've listened to Jason and David and 100 other people and they can do the maths. This is an absolutely unique situation. So that's the plan. That's what I'm paid to do, isn't it? Tell you the plan. You know, it's a collective effort. We all need to support each other. We all know it sucks. We just need to get on with it. This is totally 100% winnable. We all need to know that. We all know it, right? We need to get off this call. We need to sign up. Some of us can't sign up to be arrested. We know that. Well, most of the people on this call can. Let's be honest with ourselves. Then we have to go out and mobilize. Some people in this call will have to give up their jobs. Some people need to work part-time. Some people work full-time. Some people won't be able to do that, but many of you can. This is it. It's the end of the world. And donate. Don't donate £10. Donate £1,000. It costs £1,000 to get an affinity group on the road. Donate £1,000. If you can't donate £1,000, then donate what you can. But many of you can donate £1,000. What's the point of having in your bank account, right? Donate it. This is serious. We raised £80,000 in 4 weeks with Insulate Britain. We've got £200,000 coming in. We probably need £1 million. This is it. Think big. That's it. That's my bit. Thank you so much again, Jason and David. Thank you. I'm passing on to the real guys, two of the younger ones.
Thank you, Roger. Yeah, I'm not crying anymore, but I'm still feeling very emotional. I think maybe I feel a bit more inspired about action. Yeah, I think getting arrested is not even a fraction as terrifying as just being on this Zoom call and hearing the truth. So yeah, I hope we can all be on the road together very soon. Okay, next we're going to hear from a couple of people who are signing up to do civil resistance in March and why they're doing that and how they feel about that. So first we're going to go to Tabby. Tabby, can you hear me?
Yeah.
I'm just going to pass straight over to you and you can introduce yourself and tell us why you're doing what you're doing.
Yeah, that's fine. Yeah, okay, as you heard, I'm Tabby, I'm 21, and at the moment I'm a student at Glasgow Uni, and I'm taking action in March because this is our best bet. Like, I never know really what to say in these kind of things. Like, I'm very new to all this, but I'll just give a bit of background why I'm here. And I guess I saw XR did in 2019 and I was like, yeah, like, oh, maybe these guys have a plan. Like, it's quite fucked from what I saw then. And that's, again, when I started to think about it. And I went along and did some stuff and I got arrested. But in the back of my mind, when I did all these random actions, I kind of knew that it was a bit pointless. And I knew that we were going to have to do something together and much bigger, and something that unfortunately would involve a bit more sacrifice. And I thought, you know, if it's bad as people say and what I've read and what these people have been telling me the whole time, then we'd be doing more. And when I realized that there was no plan and these people had no strategy, I became very depressed and overwhelmed. I still feel overwhelmed a lot of the time, and lonely, because other people my age, and I guess most people, couldn't care less. And people seen the groups I was in, they seemed to be happy to just go along doing that kind of activism or actions they like to do that didn't seem to be getting us anywhere. And they were pointless in like the face of the annihilation that we've just heard about that's going to be taking place. So the other thing that scares me, like, is that there's not going to be any point when people wake up and realize what's going on. Like, there's so much shit going on now with climate catastrophe, and people don't care, and to be honest, I feel far away from it. And so as things get worse and worse, my worst fear is that people in England and other parts of the world will just continue to ignore it and we won't do anything. And yeah, no one's coming to save us. So that's the reality we face. And yeah, we will get things wrong, and we have. And as I said before, that's reality, and we don't get many more goes at this. So we've got to look at the social science that we've got, and we're going to have to fight. And it's not going to be particularly pleasant. And yeah, the lie, though, is that we're powerless. I never thought that I could speak in front of people like this, so many people, and try and convince students to take action and get their shit together, which is a terrifying thing for me to do, because I don't know if I'm going to be able to convince them. And yeah, basically the truth is that most people aren't going to be willing to do what's required. We don't need everyone, but if you're sitting here right now thinking that you can do it, then you need to do it. Because right now we still have choices, and we're going to have less and less choices, and they might not be particularly comfortable. But yeah, I feel that my choices are constricted generally. Like I want to have children, but I can't think about this without feeling like incredibly upset. And I want to finish my degree, but I don't think that's going to happen now. Yeah, as you've heard tonight, we don't have much longer, and there's no going back. So yeah, sign up to the action and go to the MBDA, because it's good. Thank you.
Thank you, Tabby. Thank you so much for you. Yeah, I think it's unrealistic to expect that we're going to be able to make the change we want to see without a lot of people making a lot of sacrifices. And not a single person has ever regretted making any of those sacrifices as well. So thank you. We're going to go next to Louis, who was part of the Insulate Britain campaign. You may have heard of it. And he got out of is it Thameside prison 8 days ago after serving 6 weeks there for the crime of causing a traffic jam to raise the alarm of climate emergency and the need for insulation. So we're going to go to Louis, and I'll just pass straight over to you, Louis.
Hi everybody. Well, a lot of tough acts to follow, but I'll do my best. My name's Louis McKechnie. I'm 21 years old, and from a young age, I was painfully aware of the climate crisis. My mum was a Green Party councillor and would make absolutely sure I know that the world is fucked, basically. And so growing up, I wanted to become a mechanical engineer and work in green energy and do my bit to save the world that way. I went to uni, I did the degree, I got about 2 years through it before I started reading the science on how bad it actually is. And I found out that we don't have the time for that. We don't have the time. We have like none. We have a few years to turn this around. And so I started with Extinction Rebellion. I organized my university group. When that didn't get any results, I was getting pretty desperate. I was quite depressed about the state of the world and how I felt like I was powerless to do anything about it. Started doing actions, did, I don't know, 6 arrests over a couple of months. Nothing changed. For a moment during each action, I felt like I was doing something good, that maybe it might have an impact. And in a little way, they had the impacts, but tiny and not enough. And after that, I would have liked to continue with my degree, but I just felt so hopeless with the state of the world and so powerless. I felt like I had to do something. I couldn't sit by and watch as everything I love burned and all the people I love go through the end of the world. And so I dropped everything, dropped all my things that I was doing in life and went and did Insulate Britain. And it was pretty scary, to be honest. Being arrested over and over again is pretty scary. Each arrest is actually a lot less scary than the one before. It's at the point now where I feel like I could probably quite enjoy being in a police cell, but, you know, different matter, I guess. And for once in my life, I felt like I was actually able to do something, that I wasn't powerless to the climate crisis that's going to destroy my whole generation. You know, as a 21-year-old, this is my future. Everybody I know my age, we're all going to have to live through the result of this. And so I kept going. And it reached a point in the campaign where we found out we're not looking at a week on remand, we're looking at potentially up to 2 years in prison. And it took me a couple of days to think about it. And at first I was terrified. I said I'd never risk that much time in prison. But then I read the science. Like, I'm sure you've heard some science today, which has made you think. And I realized we have to do this because this has to work. And so I went to prison for it. I had caught on my 21st birthday, actually. I went into the courtroom and the judge sentenced me to 3 months in prison for my actions. And I was absolutely terrified of what that was going to be like. They put us on the prison van, taking us to the prison. I was shitting myself. I'd been told all these horror stories. I was going to hate it. At this point, despite all this fear, I didn't regret what I'd done. I knew I was doing it for the right reasons. And I knew it had to be done. And if we're not going to be the ones to do it, then nobody's going to do it. There's nobody else. So I got to prison, and the first officers I encountered were kind of dicks, to be honest. They were, I guess, trying to intimidate us. They themselves had been blocked by one of our roadblocks previously, so they had a bit of an axe to grind with us. And then as soon as we got to the cell, 2 prisoners came over and said, "Hi, we're the people who run this wing. We heard what you're in for." And I was like, fuck. And they were like, "We have a lot of respect for you. You know, you're doing a great thing. Anybody in here who doesn't think so is uneducated. And if there's any trouble, we'll protect you." And I was like, what the fuck? I was not expecting it at all. It was quite a surprise to me. And yeah, it was strange. And then, like, all the stereotypes about prison turned out not to be true. You know, my cellmate was quite nice and quiet. The food was all right. The people in there were kind and compassionate, and, you know, they all were interested in what I was in for, and they all thought it was cool. A lot of them come from quite impoverished backgrounds, so they understand Insulated Britain would affect fuel poverty, and a lot of them are my age, so a lot of them are going to have trouble when the climate crisis hits as well. And so what was meant to be this experience that should have deterred me from future action, the judge said that they were sentencing us to prison to deter us from future action. And I got to say, it didn't work. I'm undeterred. In fact, I'm a lot less scared of going back than I was going in the first time. You know, honestly, the whole idea that we cannot take action because of the consequences our government will inflict on us, it's a bunch of shit. You know, like, some of you will have been arrested before, and you will have realized being arrested is nowhere near as bad as it was advertised. It's the same story with prison. It's, you know, it's not a serious thing. It's just, I mean, it's a bit serious, but like, it's perfectly manageable, and you get to keep in contact with your friends outside. You have a phone in the cell. And yeah, I guess. And when I came out of prison, I was surrounded by the most loving, kind-hearted community, and I'd never felt more supported. And I realized that I had given up my passion. I wanted to go become an engineer, but I'm honestly happier doing this. It's absolutely changed my life. You know, the people I'm around who support me doing this activism, I don't think I could go back. And that's not just because of the fact that I now know the science. It's also because the people around here make fighting the end of the world so much easier. And yeah, there's one story I'd like to share from a block during Insulated Britain, actually, that I didn't expect. I've told this a bit out of order. I should have said this earlier. But I think it was the 4th block. It was in a really urban area, middle of London. And I thought, and we were told going into it, if ever there's going to be violence breaking out on a block, it's going to be this one. which is just what you want to hear when you're about to plant your arse in front of a lorry. So we go out, I sit down, lorry comes over, sits half a meter from my face, just sits on the horn. And I'm like, shit, this is going to be really unpleasant. And the police were like, not even there at all. So for once I was like, I hope the police get here. And they didn't for a while yet. But one of our de-escalators went over and talked to the lorry driver for like 3 or 4 minutes. And the lorry driver turned off his truck, came out and talked to us one-on-one. And he said to me, thank you for what you're doing. I'm sorry for honking at you. I didn't get it. And he even recorded as the police came to make sure they treated us fairly. And I think it goes to show that when people do start to understand what we're doing, they're going to have a lot more sympathy for us. And hopefully they'll do the same. I feel like I might have been rambling a bit, but that's me. I'll pass back. Thanks.